The tariffs had been imposed. The countermove had landed. Now came the hardest part of any trade war, not the fighting but the accounting. Every trade war ends the same way it begins, with a story. Politicians tell it in speeches, markets tell it in prices, and eventually economists tell it in spreadsheets. And the spreadsheets rarely agree with the speeches. By the summer of 2026, 18 months of tariffs, court battles, and rare earth brinkmanship had produced enough data for someone to finally add up the ledger. When Steven Rattner did exactly that on camera, the number he arrived at was not the one Washington had promised. This is the story of the reckoning, what the trade war actually cost, who actually paid for it, and the uncomfortable lesson buried underneath every chart. In a world this interconnected, victory is a much harder thing to declare than it used to be. By the time the dust had settled enough to take stock, the trade war had produced an enormous quantity of data, trade flows, employment figures, price indices, corporate earnings calls, court rulings, and remarkably little consensus about what any of it actually proved. This is, in itself, one of the defining features of modern economic conflict. Unlike a military war, where victory and defeat are usually visible on a map, a trade war's outcome has to be reconstructed from statistics that different observers can, and did, read in strikingly different ways. Steven Rattner's assessment, delivered on Bloomberg in the summer of 2026 under the blunt framing that would give this documentary its title, was one of the more widely discussed attempts to cut through that ambiguity. Rattner brought a particular set of credentials to the question: decades on Wall Street, a stint inside the Obama administration overseeing the restructuring of the American auto industry, and years of tracking exactly the kind of manufacturing and trade data at the center of this fight. His analysis walked through the same three promises that had defined the policy from the start: reshored manufacturing, a narrowed trade deficit, and negotiating leverage over Beijing, and matched each one against the data as it actually stood, rather than as it had been forecast. On manufacturing, the picture Rattner and others in his camp pointed to was one of narrow, subsidy-driven gains rather than the broad industrial revival that had been promised. Semiconductor investment, bolstered heavily by direct government incentives running in parallel with the tariffs, showed genuine strength. But manufacturing employment as a whole had not seen the kind of durable, broad-based hiring surge the political rhetoric had led people to expect, and in several import-dependent manufacturing subsectors, higher input costs from tariffs on steel, aluminum, and components had made American producers less competitive rather than more, occasionally costing jobs in the very factories the policy aimed to protect. On the trade deficit, the analysis pointed to what had become, by this point, a well-documented pattern: a narrower bilateral deficit with China sitting alongside a trade balance with the rest of the world that had not meaningfully improved, because the deficit had never really been a China-specific phenomenon to begin with. It was a function of how much the United States, as a whole economy, saved versus spent, borrowed versus invested, deep structural facts that a tariff schedule aimed at one country, however aggressive, could rear out but not resolve. And on leverage, the promise that tariffs would force Beijing into a position of clear capitulation. The rare earth standoff stood as the central piece of evidence that this, too, had not unfolded as promised. China's willingness and ability to restrict access to materials the American and Allied industrial base had no immediate substitute for demonstrated that the assumed asymmetry of power, market size against market size, did not hold once you accounted for who controlled which physical inputs. If anything, the episode had revealed an American vulnerability more clearly than it had revealed a Chinese one. A vulnerability 3 decades in the making, and one that no single term of tariff policy could undo, however aggressively pursued. Taken together, this was the basis for the assessment that gave the documentary its name. On the specific metrics the policy itself had promised to move, the exchange had not gone the way Washington had told the country it would go. That did not mean China's own economy emerged unscathed. Export-dependent Chinese manufacturers absorbed real losses, growth forecasts were revised downward at points during the standoff, and Beijing's own leadership treated the confrontation as a serious and costly one to manage, not a costless victory lap. But relative to the specific promises made, rebuilt American factories, a narrow deficit, decisive leverage, the numbers in Rattner's reading and that of a number of other economists tracking the same data simply did not support declaring the policy a success on its own terms. This assessment did not go unchallenged, and it would be inaccurate to present it as the only serious reading of the same data. Defenders of the tariff policy, inside the administration and among sympathetic economists, offered a different framework for judging success. They argued that some of the policy's most important effects were structural and long-term rather than immediate, that genuine supply chain diversification away from total dependence on any single country had begun, even if it hadn't yet produced a fully reshored manufacturing base, that new investment commitments in strategic industries represented real, if partial, progress, and that negotiating leverage, while messier and more contested than promised, had nonetheless produced concrete agreements on specific issues, including cooperation on chemicals used in illicit fentanyl production. On this view, judging an 18-month policy against goals that were always understood, by serious observers, to require a decade or more of sustained effort was itself a kind of unfair test, a snapshot mistaken for a final tally. There was also a harder, more uncomfortable argument made by some defenders of the policy, that even an economically costly tariff war might still be judged worthwhile if it succeeded in reducing long-term strategic dependence on a geopolitical rival, regardless of the short-term price paid by American consumers and companies. Under this framing, the correct question was not simply did the trade deficit shrink, but is the United States now less vulnerable to Chinese economic coercion than it was before? A question the rare earth standoff itself, ironically, made more urgent rather than less, since it demonstrated exactly the kind of dependency the policy supporters said they were trying to escape in the first place. What both camps agreed on, however revealing in itself, was the underlying diagnosis. The rare earth vulnerability was real, it was serious, and closing it would require years of sustained investment in mining, refining, and allied nation supply chains that no tariff schedule, however aggressive, could substitute for. Whether one believed the trade war had been worth its cost or not, almost no serious economist disputed that the episode had exposed a structural weakness in the American and Allied industrial base that predated the conflict by decades, and that would outlast it by years, regardless of who ultimately came out ahead in the political argument over the headline numbers. There is a broader lesson in this story that outlasts the specific policy debate, one worth pulling out from underneath the partisan argument over Rattner's verdict. Modern global supply chains are not simple bilateral arrangements that a single government can rewire through tariff schedules and emergency declarations, however sweeping. They are dense, decades-old networks of interdependence, built one investment decision at a time across dozens of countries, where leverage is distributed unevenly and often invisibly, sitting, in this case, not in the size of a consumer market but in the chemistry of a handful of obscure elements most people had never heard of before this fight forced them into the headlines. The trade war of 2025 and 2026 did not end with a clean winner raising a flag over a vanquished opponent, however the headlines chose to frame it. It ended, more truthfully, with two governments recalculating their assumptions about power in a global economy neither one fully controlled, and with a set of economic data that, months and years later, will likely still be argued over by historians and economists trying to determine exactly what was won, what was lost, and what it actually cost to find out. What is not in dispute is this. The world that emerges from this confrontation is one where rare earth minerals sit permanently higher on the list of strategic national priorities than they did before, where supply chain resilience is treated as seriously as military readiness in a growing number of capitals, and where the simple story, tariffs in, factories out, deficit down, has been replaced by a far more complicated and honest one about just how tightly two rival economies had grown together, and how much both sides still had left to learn about where their own power truly began and ended. That, in the end, may be the most durable lesson of the entire episode, more durable, certainly, than any single tariff rate or court ruling. Whoever won, in the narrow sense of any one quarter's trade statistics, Both economies came out of this confrontation having learned the same hard truth. In a world this interconnected, no one holds all the leverage, and the cost of finding that out is always higher than either side expects going in.